Hey guys, tonight we begin not with fancy dresses and social debutantes, but with the very personal, very peculiar world of Victorian hygiene. We're stepping into a time when people feared fresh air more than factory smoke, when arsenic could double as makeup, and when your neighbour might literally bathe once a week and call it excessive. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Cleanliness is next to godliness, said absolutely everyone in the Victorian era, except they had some very creative interpretations of what cleanliness actually meant. Let's begin with a surprising fact. In the early Victorian period, around the 1840s, many people genuinely believed that bathing too frequently could kill you. Not because of drowning, though that was also a concern, but because they thought hot water weakened the body's natural defences and made you susceptible to disease. This wasn't just superstition, it was medical advice. Doctors warned that excessive bathing could lead to everything from consumption to moral decay. The theory went like this. Your body produced a protective layer of dirt and oil that acted as armour against illness. Scrub it away too often, and you'd essentially be walking around naked to the germs. It was like medieval thinking with better hats. Water itself was viewed with deep suspicion. In an era before germ theory was widely accepted, people couldn't see the connection between dirty water and disease. Instead, they blamed miasma, or bad air, for spreading illness. This led to the peculiar belief that smelling bad was actually healthier than smelling good, because strong body odour meant your natural defences were working. The irony, of course, is that this was also the era of massive industrial cities, coal smoke and open sewers. London's Thames was essentially a flowing toilet, and the air quality was somewhere between unhealthy and apocalyptic. But rather than addressing these obvious health hazards, Victorian medical wisdom focused on the dangers of soap and warm water. It didn't help that public bathhouses had developed a reputation for being hotbeds of immorality and disease. Unlike their medieval predecessors, Victorian bathhouses were often associated with the working poor, prostitution, and general unsavouriness. Respectable people didn't frequent such establishments. Instead, they stayed dirty and called it virtuous. So yes, early Victorians feared bathing, but not because they were lazy or ignorant. They were trying, in their own 19th century way, to stay healthy. Unfortunately, without understanding bacteria, indoor plumbing, or basic sanitation, their strategy was more paranoia than prevention. Welcome to an era where a weekly wash was considered radical, where makeup contained enough poison to kill a horse, and where the phrase "cleanliness is next to godliness" was taken so literally that people prayed before approaching a bathtub. Once upon a time, in a London that smelled like horse manure and industrial ambition, the Victorian bathroom was not a room at all. It was a concept, a dream, and for most people, a luxury so remote it might as well have been located on Mars. For the vast majority of the 19th century, the idea of a dedicated space for washing was as foreign as electricity or the telephone. In the early Victorian period, most homes didn't have bathrooms. They had washstands, chamber pots, and a lot of creative improvisation. The wealthy might have a dressing room with a wash basin and pitcher, but even they didn't have what we'd recognise as a proper bathroom. Instead, bathing was an event, like a small theatrical production that required planning, preparation, and a small army of servants. When someone of means decided to take a bath, it was a process. Servants would heat water in the kitchen, carry it upstairs in buckets, and pour it into a portable tub that was often made of copper or zinc. The whole affair could take hours to set up and left the bather sitting in what was essentially a large expensive soup bowl in the middle of their bedroom. The poor, meanwhile, made do with whatever they could find. A basin of cold water was a luxury. Many simply used a damp cloth to wipe down the essential areas, which typically meant face, hands and feet. Full-body bathing was reserved for special occasions like weddings, Christmas, or suspected plague outbreaks. Public bathhouses existed, but they were grim affairs. These weren't the social clubs of ancient Rome or medieval Europe. They were utilitarian spaces designed for the masses who had no other option. The water was often shared, rarely changed, and heated by coal fires that filled the air with smoke. The experience was less spa day and more survive this ordeal. Then around the 1860s, things began to change. The Great Stink of 1858, when London's sewage system essentially collapsed and the Thames became an open sewer, finally convinced people that sanitation might be worth investing in. Suddenly, the connection between filth and disease became harder to ignore, even for the most stubborn anti-bathing advocates. Indoor plumbing began to appear in wealthy homes, though it was still considered experimental and possibly dangerous. Early Victorian toilets were marvels of engineering and sources of constant anxiety. They flushed, but into what? And would the sewer gases creep back up and poison the household? These were legitimate concerns in an era when sewer gas was believed to cause everything from cholera to moral corruption. By the 1870s, the first purpose-built bathrooms appeared in upper-class homes. These were grand affairs, often featuring elaborate tiles, copper fixtures, and enough space to hold a small dinner party. The bathtub itself was a statement piece, carved from marble or cast in iron and decorated like a piece of furniture. But even with these innovations, many Victorians remained sceptical. Bathing was still seen as potentially weakening, morally questionable, and medically risky. The bathroom might have arrived, but the Victorian relationship with hygiene remained complicated, contradictory, and occasionally toxic. Literally, in the case of the wallpaper, which often contained enough arsenic to kill a Victorian family slowly and stylishly. Despite the growing availability of bathrooms and the gradual acceptance that maybe, just maybe, washing wasn't going to kill you, Victorian bathing remained a carefully regulated affair, governed by strict social rules, medical theories, and a healthy dose of paranoia. First, let's talk about frequency. A full bath once a week was considered perfectly adequate for most Victorians, and many doctors recommended even less. The reasoning was that too much bathing would strip away the body's natural oils and leave you vulnerable to disease. Some physicians suggested that a proper Victorian should bathe no more than once every 2 weeks, and then only in lukewarm water to avoid shocking the system. The wealthy, of course, had more options. They might take a full bath weekly and supplement it with daily ablutions, essentially washing their face, hands, and sometimes feet with a washcloth and basin. This was considered sufficient for maintaining health and respectability, as long as the visible parts of the body remained clean. When a Victorian did decide to take a bath, the process was elaborate. Water had to be heated, often in large copper pots, over an open fire. Servants would carry bucket after bucket upstairs, pouring it into a portable tub that was usually made of copper, zinc, or occasionally wood. The whole process could take hours and required significant planning. Bath water was precious and never wasted. In households with multiple family members, it was common for everyone to use the same bath water, starting with the head of the household and working down through the family hierarchy. By the time the youngest children got their turn, the water was often grey, cold, and contained enough dirt to fertilise a small garden. But waste not, want not. The temperature was crucial. Victorian medical wisdom held that hot water was dangerous because it opened the pores and allowed disease to enter the body. Lukewarm was preferred, and some doctors recommended cold baths as the healthiest option. The truly brave might take a Russian bath, which involved sitting in cold water while having hot water poured over their head. This was considered both invigorating and medically beneficial, though it sounds more like medieval torture. Bath additives were popular among those who could afford them. Salt was believed to strengthen the skin, oatmeal was thought to soften it, and various herbs were added for their supposed medicinal properties. Bran baths were fashionable among ladies who believed they would improve their complexion. The wealthy might add milk, honey, or even wine to their bath water, though whether this had any real benefit beyond making them smell like a dessert is debatable. Privacy was another consideration. Even in wealthy homes with dedicated bathrooms, mixed-gender bathing was absolutely forbidden. Husbands and wives often bathed on different days or at different times to maintain proper decorum. The idea of sharing a bathtub with one's spouse was considered scandalous and possibly immoral. For those without access to a proper bathtub, sponge baths were the norm. This involved using a large sponge or cloth to wash the body piece by piece, usually while standing over a basin. It was efficient, used less water, and could be done in any room with a washstand. The Victorian sponge bath was an art form of modesty and practicality. So no, Victorians didn't bathe daily like we do, but they weren't completely opposed to the idea of cleaning themselves. They just approached it with the same combination of scientific theory, social convention, and mild terror that they applied to most aspects of life. After all, this was an era when people believed that sitting near an open window could cause pneumonia and that reading novels could lead to hysteria. By those standards, weekly bathing was practically progressive. If Victorian hair had a motto, it would probably be elaborate but unwashed, with a subtitle of "Please don't look too closely." Hair care in the 19th century was a complex mixture of fashion, chemistry, and wishful thinking, where the goal was to achieve maximum volume and style with minimum actual cleaning. Let's start with the obvious. Victorians didn't wash their hair very often. Once a month was considered perfectly adequate, and many people went even longer between washes. The reasoning was similar to the bathing paranoia. Too much washing would strip the hair of its natural oils and leave it weak, brittle, and prone to falling out. Victorian women, in particular, prized their long, thick hair as a symbol of femininity and health, so they were understandably cautious about doing anything that might damage it. When they did wash their hair, the process was an ordeal. There was no running hot water in most homes, so water had to be heated in pots and carried to wherever the washing was taking place. Shampoo as we know it didn't exist. Instead, people used a mixture of soap and water, often with various additives like egg yolks, beer or vinegar. Soap itself was harsh and alkaline, more suited to washing laundry than delicate hair. It often left hair feeling dry, tangled, and looking dull. To combat this, people would rinse with various solutions designed to restore shine and manageability. Beer was popular because the alcohol was thought to add body, and the hops were believed to be good for the scalp. Vinegar was used to cut through soap residue and add shine. Lemon juice was supposed to lighten hair and remove build-up. Between washes, Victorian hair care was all about management and styling. Brushing was considered essential, but not just for appearance. The Victorians believed that brushing stimulated the scalp and distributed natural oils throughout the hair, keeping it healthy. 100 brush strokes a day was the recommended minimum, and some people brushed their hair for much longer. The brushes themselves were works of art. Made from boar bristles, silver handles, and often decorated with intricate engravings, a good hairbrush was a prized possession, passed down through generations. The wealthy might own multiple brushes for different purposes: soft brushes for children, firm brushes for thick hair, and special brushes for styling. Hair oils and pomades were essential for keeping hair manageable between washes. These were usually made from animal fats like bear grease or lard, mixed with various scents to mask the smell. Macassar oil, made from coconut oil and palm oil, was particularly popular among men. It was so widely used that furniture makers began adding antimacassars, small doilies, to the backs of chairs to protect the fabric from hair oil stains. Women's hair required even more elaborate care. The fashionable styles of the Victorian era, elaborate updos, ringlets, and towering constructions, required hours of preparation and significant amounts of product. Hair was often crimped, curled, and teased into submission, using heated irons, papers, and various setting lotions. Hairpins were crucial for maintaining these elaborate styles. Victorian women might use dozens of pins to keep their hair in place, creating structures so complex that they often slept sitting up to avoid disturbing their handiwork. Some styles were so elaborate that they were left in place for days or even weeks, which meant that washing hair became even more infrequent. For colour, Victorian women had limited and often dangerous options. Henna was used to create red tints, though it was expensive and difficult to apply evenly. Some women used lead-based dyes to darken their hair, which could cause lead poisoning over time. Others resorted to washing their hair with various teas or herbal infusions to enhance their natural colour. Baldness was a particular horror for Victorian men, who tried various dubious remedies to prevent or reverse hair loss. These included everything from bear grease to electrical treatments to mysterious tonics containing questionable ingredients. Most of these remedies were useless at best and harmful at worst, but desperation made them popular. In the end, Victorian hair care was a delicate balance between cleanliness and preservation, fashion and function. The result was hair that often looked magnificent from a distance, but probably didn't smell particularly fresh up close. Still, in an era when hats were mandatory for public appearances, perhaps the state of one's hair underneath was less important than we might think today. Dental care in Victorian England was less sparkling smile and more, please let me keep most of my teeth until I'm 30. The Victorian approach to oral hygiene was a fascinating mixture of genuine medical knowledge, complete misconceptions, and dental practices that make modern root canal surgery look like a spa treatment. Let's start with the tools of the trade. Toothbrushes existed, but they were luxury items made from bone or ivory handles, with bristles from boar hair. These weren't the soft, comfortable brushes we know today. They were stiff, coarse, and often more effective at removing gums than plaque. The wealthy might own elaborate silver-handled toothbrushes, while the poor made do with rough cloths or simply used their fingers. Toothpaste was equally primitive. Commercial toothpastes began appearing in the mid-Victorian period, but they were often abrasive mixtures containing chalk, charcoal, or even ground brick dust. The goal was to scrub away stains and debris, regardless of whether this also scrubbed away tooth enamel. Some toothpastes contained soap, which at least provided some cleaning action, though the taste was probably somewhere between unpleasant and horrifying. For those who couldn't afford commercial products, homemade tooth powders were common. These might contain salt, baking soda, crushed cuttlefish bone, or powdered charcoal. More exotic recipes included ground coral, dragon's blood, a tree resin, not actual dragon, and various herbs and spices. The results were mixed. Some of these ingredients were actually beneficial, while others were merely abrasive or even harmful. The Victorian understanding of dental health was incomplete but improving. They knew that sugar was bad for teeth, though they didn't understand the bacterial mechanism involved. They also recognised that cleaning teeth was important, though their methods often did more harm than good. The concept of regular dental checkups was virtually unknown. Most people only saw a tooth puller when they were in agony, and tooth pullers they were, rather than dentists as we know them. These were often barbers, blacksmiths, or travelling practitioners who combined tooth extraction with other medical procedures. Anaesthesia wasn't widely available until the latter part of the Victorian era, so dental procedures were exercises in pain tolerance. extraction was often the only treatment available for dental problems, leading to widespread tooth loss among all social classes. The wealthy had access to more sophisticated dental care, including early forms of dental restoration. False teeth were available, though they were expensive and often uncomfortable. The best dentures were made from ivory, but cheaper versions might be carved from wood or even made from teeth extracted from corpses. George Washington famously wore dentures made from a combination of ivory, gold, and human teeth, though his were probably more comfortable than most Victorian versions. Dental hygiene was further complicated by Victorian dietary habits. Sugar consumption increased dramatically during this period as colonial trade made sugar more affordable. Sweets, pastries, and sugary drinks became popular among all social classes, leading to widespread dental decay. The Victorians loved their sugar, but their teeth paid the price. The concept of fluoride was unknown, and water quality varied dramatically depending on location and social class. The wealthy might drink bottled spring water, while the poor relied on whatever was available from public wells or pumps. Much of the water was contaminated with bacteria and other harmful substances, but the Victorians were more concerned about miasmas and bad air than waterborne diseases. Mouthwashes and breath fresheners were popular, though their effectiveness was questionable. These often contained alcohol, herbs, and various oils designed to mask bad breath rather than address its causes. Some contained dangerous ingredients like mercury or lead, which could cause more problems than they solved. Children's dental care was particularly neglected. Many people believed that baby teeth weren't important, since they would fall out anyway, so little effort was made to keep them clean. This led to early dental problems that often persisted into adulthood. The idea that early dental care could prevent later problems was not widely understood. Despite these challenges, some progress was made during the Victorian era. The first dental schools were established, professional standards began to emerge, and the understanding of dental health gradually improved. By the end of the century, the concept of preventive dental care was beginning to take hold, though it would be many more decades before modern dental hygiene practices became standard. In the meantime, the average Victorian lived with dental problems that we would find shocking today. Tooth loss was common and expected, bad breath was endemic, and dental pain was simply a fact of life. The phrase "long in the tooth" comes from this era, when receding gums exposed more of the tooth and was a sign of advancing age. In a society where life expectancy was relatively short, perhaps the long-term consequences of poor dental care seemed less important than they do today. Let's be honest, if you time-travelled to a bustling Victorian street, your first reaction wouldn't be admiration for the elegant architecture or the sophisticated fashion. It would be an overwhelming urge to find the nearest gas mask, because Victorian England smelled like a combination of industrial waste, human misery, and optimism gone wrong. Victorian cities were olfactory nightmares on an unprecedented scale. London, the crown jewel of the empire, was also its most fragrant disaster. The Thames was essentially an open sewer flowing through the heart of the city. Industrial smokestacks belched coal smoke 24 hours a day. Horse manure carpeted the streets in a thick, steaming layer that turned to mud when it rained and dust when it didn't. And then there were the people, millions of unwashed, poorly ventilated people living in close quarters without adequate sanitation. So how did Victorians cope with this assault on their senses? They got creative, and their solutions ranged from ingenious to utterly bizarre. The pomander made a comeback in Victorian England, though in more sophisticated forms than their medieval predecessors. These small perforated containers, filled with aromatic substances, were carried by anyone who could afford them. The wealthy might have silver pomanders filled with expensive spices and essential oils, while the middle class made do with cheaper versions containing dried herbs and flowers. Perfumed handkerchiefs were essential accessories for the fashionable Victorian. These weren't just decorative, they were survival tools. A quick sniff of lavender water or eau de cologne could provide temporary relief from the overwhelming stench of urban life. Ladies would discreetly hold their perfumed handkerchiefs to their noses while walking through crowded areas, a practice that was both socially acceptable and practically necessary. The Victorians also embraced the power of flowers and herbs with religious fervour. Nosegays, small bouquets of aromatic flowers and herbs, were carried by those who could afford them. These weren't just fashion accessories, they were believed to ward off disease as well as bad smells. The theory was that pleasant scents could counteract the harmful effects of miasma, the bad air that was thought to cause illness. Scented vinegars were popular among all social classes. These were mixtures of vinegar with various herbs and spices, carried in small bottles for emergency olfactory relief. A few drops on a handkerchief could provide temporary respite from overwhelming odours. Some people even used scented vinegars as smelling salts, inhaling them directly when feeling overwhelmed by bad air or strong emotions. For those who could afford it, perfume became an essential daily armour against the hostile aromatic environment. Victorian perfumes were often heavy, complex compositions designed to create a powerful scent barrier around the wearer. Popular ingredients included rose, jasmine, lavender, and various exotic spices imported from the colonies. The goal wasn't subtlety, it was olfactory dominance. The home front required different strategies. Victorian houses were filled with potpourri, scented sachets, and aromatic herbs designed to combat the smells that inevitably crept in from outside. Windows were often kept closed, not just for security, but to keep out the stench of the streets. This created its own problems, as poor ventilation led to stuffy, stale air inside, but at least it was familiar stuffy air, rather than the unknown horrors waiting outside. Burning various aromatic substances was another popular method of scent control. Incense, scented candles, and aromatic woods were burned in homes and public spaces. Some people burned lavender or rosemary in their fireplaces, while others used more exotic substances like frankincense or myrrh. The goal was to create a pleasant aromatic environment that masked or overwhelmed less pleasant odours. The Victorians also employed what we might call scent zoning. Different areas of the house might be dedicated to different aromatic purposes. Drawing rooms might be scented with flowers, while kitchens used herbs and spices. Bedrooms often featured lavender or other calming scents, while bathrooms, when they existed, might use stronger disinfectant odours. Public spaces required more dramatic interventions. Theatres, churches, and other gathering places often employed professional air sweeteners, who would spray perfumed water or burn aromatic substances to make the environment more tolerable. Some establishments used elaborate ventilation systems designed to pull in fresh air and expel stale, smelly air, though these were expensive and not always effective. Personal scent management was a constant battle. People carried multiple aromatic aids: perfumed handkerchiefs, pomanders, scented vinegars, and small bottles of eau de cologne. The well-prepared Victorian was essentially a walking pharmacy of pleasant smells, ready to deploy chemical warfare against any olfactory assault. The irony, of course, is that many of these solutions simply added more smells to an already overwhelming environment. A crowded Victorian gathering might feature dozens of different perfumes, potpourris, and aromatic substances, all competing for dominance. The result was often a complex, layered olfactory experience that was arguably no more pleasant than the original problem. Still, the Victorian approach to scent management shows remarkable ingenuity and determination. Faced with an environment that assaulted their senses daily, they refused to simply accept it. Instead, they fought back with flowers, herbs, perfumes, and a remarkable variety of aromatic weapons. It may not have been a complete victory, but it was a valiant effort in the ongoing war between civilization and its own smells. If you've ever worried about your deodorant failing during an important meeting, spare a thought for the Victorians who faced the challenge of body odour armed with nothing but determination, desperation, and a surprisingly creative arsenal of questionable remedies. The concept of deodorant as we know it simply didn't exist in Victorian England. The first commercial deodorant wouldn't appear until 1888, and even then it was viewed with suspicion and used sparingly. For most of the Victorian era, people simply sweated and dealt with the consequences as best they could. This doesn't mean Victorians were oblivious to the problem of body odour. They were acutely aware of it, and social conventions developed around managing and masking the inevitable results of poor hygiene and limited washing facilities. The key was to smell less offensive than everyone else around you, which, given the general state of Victorian personal hygiene, was a surprisingly achievable goal. The most common approach was layering, not of scents, but of clothing. Multiple layers of undergarments served as absorbent barriers between the body and the outer clothing. Linen and cotton undergarments were essential because they could be washed more frequently than outer garments. A Victorian might go weeks without washing their dress or suit, but they would change their underlinen more regularly, perhaps weekly or even daily if they were wealthy enough to own multiple sets. Talcum powder was a Victorian's best friend in the battle against moisture and odour. Talc was dusted liberally over the body, particularly in areas prone to sweating. It absorbed moisture and helped prevent chafing, though it did little to address the actual source of body odour. Some people mixed their talc with aromatic powders or ground herbs to add a pleasant scent, creating what were essentially primitive body powders. Alcohol-based solutions were popular among those who understood that moisture and bacteria were somehow connected to unpleasant smells. Vinegar, witch hazel, and various alcohol-based tinctures were used as primitive antiseptics and deodorizers. These were applied with cloths or sponges to areas prone to sweating, though the process was probably almost as unpleasant as the original problem. For those who could afford them, scented soaps offered some hope of controlling body odour at its source. These soaps often contained herbs, oils, or other aromatic substances designed to leave a pleasant scent on the skin. However, soap was expensive, and the belief that too much washing was harmful meant that these aromatic benefits were short-lived. The wealthy employed more elaborate strategies. They might have servants apply scented oils or perfumes to their clothing and undergarments. Some used aromatic sachets tucked into their clothing or placed among their stored garments. The goal was to create a buffer of pleasant scents that would mask or overwhelm any natural body odours that might develop during the day. Men had particularly limited options for odour control. Victorian masculine ideals emphasised stoicism and the acceptance of natural bodily functions, so elaborate scent management was often viewed as effeminate. Men might use cologne or bay rum, but anything more elaborate was socially suspect. The result was that Victorian gentlemen often relied on frequent changes of linen, and the hope that their natural masculine scent would be viewed as appropriately virile rather than offensive. Women had more socially acceptable options for scent management, though they were still limited by the belief that excessive attention to personal hygiene was morally questionable. Ladies might use scented waters, floral oils, or aromatic powders, but always with the understanding that too much artificial scent was vulgar, and that natural femininity was preferable to obvious artifice. The medical establishment was divided on the issue of body odour. Some doctors believed that natural body scents were healthy and that attempts to suppress them were harmful. Others recognised that excessive body odour might be socially problematic and recommended modest interventions. very few understood the bacterial basis of body odour, so most remedies were based on trial and error rather than scientific understanding. Environmental factors also played a role in odour management. Victorian clothing was heavy, restrictive, and designed for modesty rather than comfort or breathability. Multiple layers of wool, cotton, and linen trapped heat and moisture, creating ideal conditions for bacterial growth and odour development. The fashion for tight corseting also restricted airflow and made it difficult for the body to regulate temperature naturally. Seasonal considerations were important as well. Summer presented obvious challenges, but winter brought its own problems. Heavy winter clothing was rarely cleaned and was worn for months at a time. Coal heating filled homes with smoke and soot that clung to clothing and hair. The combination of poor ventilation, heavy clothing, and limited washing created perfect conditions for the development and concentration of unpleasant odours. Public spaces developed their own strategies for managing the collective body odour of their patrons. Churches might burn incense, theatres used perfume sprays, and wealthy homes employed servants to regularly refresh the air with aromatic substances. These measures were partially effective, but in crowded public spaces the battle against body odour was often a losing one. The social implications of body odour were significant in Victorian society. Offensive personal scents could mark someone as lower class, immoral, or diseased. Conversely, pleasant natural scents or the subtle use of perfume could indicate refinement and social status. The ability to smell pleasant, despite limited washing facilities, became a mark of sophistication and social skill. In the end, the Victorian approach to body odour management was a complex mixture of practical strategies, social conventions, and wishful thinking. It wasn't particularly effective by modern standards, but it represented a sincere effort to maintain social acceptability in challenging circumstances. The result was a society where everyone smelled, but some smelled more acceptably than others, and where the art of olfactory diplomacy was an essential life skill. In a world without deodorant, daily showers, or synthetic fabrics, the humble undergarment became the unsung hero of Victorian hygiene. Clean linen was more than just clothing. It was the foundation of respectability, the first line of defence against the inevitable consequences of limited washing, and the closest thing to hygiene that many Victorians could practically achieve. The Victorian obsession with clean linen was both practical and symbolic. Linen and cotton undergarments absorbed sweat, oils, and other bodily secretions that would otherwise accumulate on the skin or stain expensive outer clothing. More importantly, clean undergarments were visible proof of respectability. While you might wear the same wool dress or suit for weeks, your collar, cuffs, and other visible linen could be changed regularly, creating the impression of cleanliness even when thorough washing was impractical. For Victorian women, the foundation of the linen system was the chemise or shift, a loose, lightweight garment worn directly against the skin. Made from linen or cotton, the chemise served multiple purposes. It protected the expensive outer corset from body oils and perspiration, provided a smooth foundation for the complex layers of Victorian women's clothing, and could be removed and washed separately from the rest of the outfit. Over the chemise came the corset, which might be padded with cotton or linen to absorb moisture, and provide additional protection for the expensive whalebone or steel construction. Then came additional layers, sometimes multiple petticoats, each providing another barrier between the body and the outer dress. The goal was to create a system where the garments closest to the skin could be washed regularly, while the expensive outer layers remained relatively pristine. Victorian men's undergarments followed a similar philosophy. The foundation was a linen or cotton shirt worn directly against the skin. This was covered by a vest or undershirt, then a waistcoat, and finally a coat. Like women's chemises, men's undershirts absorbed sweat and oils while protecting the more expensive outer garments. The visible parts of the shirt, particularly the collar and cuffs, were often detachable and could be changed daily even when the rest of the shirt remained in use. The quality and condition of these undergarments became important social indicators. A Victorian gentleman with crisp white collar and cuffs was signalling not just cleanliness, but social status and attention to detail. The ability to maintain pristine, visible linen required either personal wealth or access to reliable laundry services, both of which were marks of respectability. Changing undergarments was a carefully calculated social dance. The wealthy might change their entire underlinen daily, while the middle class aimed for every few days, and the poor made do with weekly changes when possible. The frequency of changes was limited not just by the availability of clean garments, but by the time and effort required for washing and drying. The washing of undergarments was a complex process that required significant time, effort, and resources. Linen and cotton had to be soaked, scrubbed, boiled, rinsed, and dried, a process that could take an entire day and required access to substantial amounts of water, soap, and fuel for heating. In urban areas, professional laundresses took over this task for those who could afford their services, but the process remained time-consuming and expensive. Starch played a crucial role in the Victorian linen system. Starched collar and cuffs not only looked crisp and professional, but also stayed cleaner longer. The starch created a protective barrier that made it harder for dirt and oils to penetrate the fabric, and starched linen could often be refreshed simply by restarching rather than full washing. The result was that a properly starched shirt could maintain its appearance for several days of wear. The social implications of the linen system were significant. In a society where full-body bathing was infrequent and deodorant didn't exist, the condition of one's visible linen became a primary indicator of personal hygiene and social status. A person with dirty or wrinkled linen was immediately marked as careless, poor, or morally suspect. Conversely, pristine linen could compensate for other hygiene deficiencies and maintain social respectability. This system created its own set of problems and social pressures. The need to maintain multiple sets of clean undergarments was expensive and time-consuming. Servants in wealthy households spent enormous amounts of time washing, drying, starching, and pressing linen. The middle class often struggled to maintain appropriate standards while managing the costs and logistics of regular linen changes. The linen system also had unexpected health benefits. While Victorians didn't understand the bacterial basis of body odour and disease, the practice of regularly changing absorbent undergarments actually did help maintain better hygiene than would have been possible otherwise. Clean linen absorbed excess moisture and oils, reducing the bacterial growth that led to unpleasant odours and skin problems. Seasonal considerations added another layer of complexity to the linen system. Summer heat meant more frequent changes were necessary, but also made washing and drying easier. Winter presented the opposite challenge. Less frequent changes might be adequate, but washing and drying became much more difficult when water froze and indoor drying space was limited. The Victorian linen system represents a fascinating example of practical adaptation to challenging circumstances. Faced with limited washing facilities, expensive clothing, and social pressure to maintain respectability, the Victorians developed a complex but effective system that allowed them to maintain the appearance of cleanliness, even when actual cleanliness was difficult to achieve. The irony is that this system, born out of necessity and social convention, was probably more hygienic than the Victorian understanding of medicine would have predicted. While doctors worried about the dangers of excessive bathing, the regular changing of absorbent undergarments actually provided significant health benefits. It was accidental hygiene. effective despite being based on social pressure rather than medical knowledge. In many ways, the Victorian obsession with clean linen laid the groundwork for modern attitudes toward personal hygiene. The idea that cleanliness could be achieved through the regular changing of clothing rather than just washing the body was revolutionary, even if it wasn't recognized as such at the time. It represented a shift toward thinking of hygiene as a manageable, practical challenge, rather than an all-or-nothing proposition. If there was one thing truly consistent in the Victorian hygiene routine, it was scratching. Not because people were allergic to their elaborate clothing, though that was certainly possible, but because they were constantly hosting an entire travelling menagerie of lice, fleas, bedbugs, and other microscopic roommates who had definitely not been invited to stay. Lice were such an everyday nuisance that they were basically treated like unwanted relatives at Christmas, annoying, persistent, and impossible to completely eliminate. Everyone had them. Rich, poor, clean, dirty, moral, immoral. Lice were the great equalizers of Victorian society, though the wealthy had better tools for managing their tiny tormentors. The Victorian approach to lice management was both systematic and resigned. Lice combs made from bone, ivory, or metal were essential personal items. These had extremely fine teeth, designed to catch lice and their eggs, and using them was a daily ritual for many people. The process was time-consuming and never entirely successful, but it kept the population under some semblance of control. Hair washing with strong soap was one method of lice control, though it was limited by the Victorian reluctance to wash hair frequently. When people did wash their hair, specifically to combat lice, they often used harsh soaps mixed with various additives believed to be toxic to the insects. Vinegar, alcohol, and even mercury-based preparations were used, though the mercury was probably more dangerous to the human than to the lice. Some people resorted to more dramatic measures. Cutting hair short or even shaving heads entirely was an effective but socially difficult solution. For women, whose long hair was considered a crucial aspect of femininity and beauty, this was often a last resort. Men had more flexibility, and short hair became increasingly fashionable, partly because it was easier to keep clean and lice-free. Bedbugs presented a different set of challenges. These insects lived in mattresses, bedding, and furniture, coming out at night to feed on sleeping humans. Victorian beds, often made with straw or horsehair mattresses and heavy fabric hangings, provided ideal hiding places for bedbugs. The insects were nearly impossible to eliminate once they became established. The Victorian approach to bedbugs involved a combination of chemical warfare and furniture management. Beds were regularly doused with various toxic substances. Turpentine, kerosene, and mercury-based preparations were popular choices. Mattresses were sometimes baked or steamed to kill the insects, though this was labour-intensive and not always effective. Furniture design began to adapt to the bedbug problem. Metal bed frames became popular partly because they provided fewer hiding places for insects. Some wealthy households employed specially designed furniture with smooth surfaces and minimal crevices where bedbugs could hide. Still, the problem persisted, and many people simply accepted nightly insect bites as part of life. Fleas were another constant companion, particularly for people who lived with animals or in close quarters. Dogs, cats, and horses all carried fleas, which readily transferred to humans. In urban areas where people lived in crowded conditions with poor sanitation, fleas thrived in the environment and found plenty of hosts. Flea management involved both personal and environmental strategies. People wore tight-fitting undergarments that made it harder for fleas to reach the skin, and some used aromatic substances believed to repel insects. Pennyroyal, lavender, and various other herbs were scattered in bedding and clothing storage areas, though their effectiveness was questionable. The wealthy employed more sophisticated pest control measures. Professional pest control services existed, using fumigation and chemical treatments to eliminate insects from homes and businesses. These services were expensive and not always effective, but they represented a more systematic approach to the problem than individual efforts. Public health authorities gradually began to recognize the connection between insects and disease transmission, though the mechanisms weren't fully understood. Some cities implemented regulations requiring regular pest control in public buildings and lodging houses, but enforcement was inconsistent and often ineffective. The clothing industry also adapted to the insect problem. Fabrics were sometimes treated with substances believed to repel insects, and clothing designs began to incorporate features that made it harder for pests to find hiding places. Smooth, tightly woven fabrics became popular, partly because they were less hospitable to insects. Personal hygiene practices evolved partly in response to insect problems. The Victorian emphasis on changing undergarments regularly was motivated not just by cleanliness, but by the practical need to interrupt insect breeding cycles. Clean linen meant fewer places for insects to lay eggs and fewer opportunities for infestations to become established. Despite all these efforts, most Victorians simply learned to live with a certain level of insect companionship. Scratching was socially acceptable, and many people developed a resigned tolerance for the constant minor irritation of insect bites. It was considered normal, and complaining too much about insects was seen as overly delicate or pretentious. The social implications of insect infestations were complex. While everyone had insects, visible signs of heavy infestation, excessive scratching, obvious bites, or insects crawling on clothing were marks of poor hygiene and lower social status. The goal wasn't to eliminate insects entirely, which was impossible, but to keep them under enough control that they weren't socially embarrassing. Some people turned insect management into a form of entertainment or social activity. Lice-picking parties where friends or family members would help each other search for and remove insects were not uncommon. These served both practical and social functions, providing insect control while creating opportunities for intimate conversation and bonding. The Victorian relationship with insects was ultimately one of grudging coexistence. Unable to eliminate the problem entirely, they developed elaborate strategies for management and containment. It was a constant, low-level battle that required ongoing attention and resources, but it was also simply part of life in an era before effective pesticides and modern understanding of insect biology. In many ways, the Victorian approach to insects mirrors their approach to hygiene generally, a combination of practical strategies, social conventions, and resigned acceptance of imperfect solutions. They couldn't solve the problem completely, but they could manage it well enough to maintain social respectability and personal comfort within the limitations of their time and technology. The Victorian toilet experience was, to put it delicately, a complex navigation between technological innovation, social propriety, and the basic human need to relieve oneself without dying of embarrassment or disease. It was an era when indoor plumbing was transitioning from miraculous luxury to middle-class aspiration, though for many it remained as distant as electric lighting or votes for women. Let's start with the wealthy, who had the privilege of pioneering what we might charitably call experimental bathroom technology. The first flush toilets began appearing in wealthy homes around the 1850s, but they were viewed with a mixture of pride and terror. These early water closets were marvels of engineering and sources of constant anxiety. They flushed, yes, but into what exactly? And would the sewer gases creep back up through the pipes and poison the entire household? This wasn't just paranoia, it was a legitimate concern. Victorian sewage systems were primitive and often overloaded. Sewer gas was believed to cause everything from cholera to moral corruption, so the installation of a flush toilet was often accompanied by elaborate ventilation systems and chemical treatments designed to prevent the deadly vapours from infiltrating the home. The wealthy toilet was often a work of art as well as a functional necessity. Elaborate porcelain bowls were decorated with flowers, coats of arms, or pastoral scenes. The surrounding bathroom might feature marble floors, ornate tilework, and enough space for a small dinner party. These weren't just bathrooms, they were statements of technological sophistication and social status. But even among the wealthy, toilet use was governed by strict social rules. Mixed gender use was absolutely forbidden, and elaborate scheduling systems ensured that family members never encountered each other in states of undress or biological necessity. Some wealthy homes had separate toilet facilities for men and women, while others employed complex timing arrangements to maintain proper decorum. For the middle class, indoor toilets were an aspiration rather than a reality for much of the Victorian era. Those who could afford them often installed a single water closet in a small room or converted closet, but the technology was expensive and often unreliable. Middle-class families might share a single toilet among multiple family members, creating logistical challenges and social tensions. The poor, meanwhile, had very different toilet experiences. Most used outdoor privies, small wooden structures, built over pits dug in the yard. These range from relatively well-maintained family facilities to shared community toilets that served multiple households. The smell was overwhelming, especially in summer, and the risk of disease was significant. Urban working-class housing often featured shared toilet facilities in courtyards or basements. These were communal toilets used by dozens of families, and they were exactly as horrible as you might imagine. Privacy was minimal, cleanliness was impossible, and the smell was legendary. These facilities were often little more than holes in the ground with minimal wooden structures for privacy. Chamber pots remained the nighttime solution for most Victorians, regardless of social class. These portable toilets were kept under beds or in bedroom cupboards for use during the night when venturing outside or to distant toilet facilities was impractical or dangerous. The contents were emptied in the morning, usually by servants in wealthy households or by family members in middle-class homes. The emptying of chamber pots was a daily ritual that required both practical skill and social discretion. Servants developed elaborate protocols for removing, cleaning, and returning chamber pots without drawing attention to their contents or disturbing the household's sense of propriety. In homes without servants, family members took turns with this unpleasant but necessary task. Public toilets were rare and often avoided by respectable people. When they did exist, they were usually segregated by gender and social class. The wealthy might have access to relatively clean, well-maintained facilities, while the poor made do with overcrowded, unsanitary public conveniences that were breeding grounds for disease and crime. Toilet paper, as we know it, didn't exist for most of the Victorian era. People used whatever was available: rags, newspapers, corn cobs, leaves, or simply their hands followed by washing with water. The wealthy might use soft cloths or even silk for this purpose, while the poor made do with whatever materials they could find or afford. The first commercial toilet paper appeared in the 1850s, but it was expensive and viewed with suspicion. Many people considered it an unnecessary luxury or even morally questionable. Too much attention to bodily comfort was seen as potentially corrupting. Those who did use toilet paper often hid their purchases or had servants buy it discreetly. Hygiene after toilet use was limited by available resources and social conventions. Hand washing was recommended, but not always practical, especially in homes without running water. People might use scented waters or vinegar rinses to clean their hands, but thorough washing was often impossible. The social implications of toilet use were significant in Victorian society. Bathroom habits were considered intensely private and were rarely discussed in polite company. The location, quality, and cleanliness of toilet facilities became important markers of social status, and access to proper facilities was often a determining factor in social mobility. Medical understanding of toilet hygiene was limited, but improving during the Victorian era. Doctors began to recognise connections between sanitation and disease, though the mechanisms weren't fully understood. This led to recommendations for better ventilation, regular cleaning, and the use of disinfectants, though implementation was often inconsistent. The Victorian toilet experience was ultimately a reflection of the era's broader struggles with modernisation, social change, and technological innovation. It represented the tension between private necessity and public propriety, between technological possibility and social convention, between individual needs and community resources. For many Victorians, toilet use remained a daily reminder of the gap between aspiration and reality, between the promise of modern civilization and the persistent challenges of basic human needs. It was a private experience shaped by public concerns, a personal necessity managed through social conventions, and a technological innovation tempered by cultural constraints. The story of Victorian toilet use is really the story of Victorian society itself, complex, contradictory, innovative, and constrained by the social and technological limitations of its time. It shows how even the most basic human needs can become complicated when filtered through the elaborate social structures and technological limitations of a particular historical moment. Before we dive into the wonderfully toxic world of Victorian cosmetics, let's pause to appreciate the irony. In an era when people feared that bathing too frequently might kill them, they had absolutely no qualms about applying lead-based makeup directly to their faces on a daily basis. The Victorian approach to beauty was less health and wellness and more looking fabulous while slowly poisoning yourself. Victorian beauty standards were very specific and utterly unforgiving. The ideal woman was pale, delicate, and ethereal. Basically, she should look like she might faint at any moment, preferably in a graceful manner that didn't disturb her elaborate hairstyle. This aesthetic preference led to some truly creative and dangerous approaches to cosmetics. Paleness was paramount, and Victorian women went to extraordinary lengths to achieve and maintain it. Sunlight was the enemy, not because of concerns about skin cancer, which wasn't understood, but because a tan indicated outdoor work and lower social status. Only peasants and working-class women had sun-touched skin. Proper ladies were pale as moonlight and twice as ethereal. To achieve this deathly pallor, Victorian women employed an arsenal of dangerous cosmetics. White lead powder was the foundation of choice, literally. This toxic substance was mixed with water or oil and applied to the face, neck, and exposed areas of the chest. It provided excellent coverage and a fashionably pale appearance, with the minor side effect of causing lead poisoning, which could result in hair loss, tooth decay, blindness, and death. But wait, there's more. Arsenic was another popular beauty ingredient, used both in cosmetics and as a dietary supplement. Arsenic was believed to improve the complexion from within, giving the skin a translucent, ethereal quality. Some women took small doses of arsenic regularly, building up a tolerance while slowly poisoning themselves. The result was indeed a pale, otherworldly appearance, partly because they were literally dying. Rice powder was a safer alternative to lead-based cosmetics, and it became increasingly popular as the century progressed. Made from finely ground rice, this powder provided a matte, pale finish without the toxic side effects. However, it was more expensive than lead-based alternatives and didn't provide the same dramatic pallor, so many women continued using the more dangerous options. For those who wanted to add a hint of colour to their deathly pale complexion, rouge was applied sparingly to the cheeks. But this wasn't the subtle blush we know today. Victorian rouge was often made from vermilion, a mercury-based compound that was as toxic as it was effective. The goal was to look naturally flushed, as if from delicate emotion rather than artificial enhancement. Eyebrow fashion was particularly dramatic in the Victorian era. The ideal eyebrow was dark, full, and perfectly shaped. Women who weren't naturally blessed with impressive eyebrows used various methods to enhance them. Burnt cork was a popular eyebrow darkener, applied with small brushes to create the desired shape and intensity. Some women even used lead-based preparations specifically formulated for eyebrow enhancement. Eye makeup was more subtle than modern standards, but still present. Kohl, made from antimony or lead, was used to darken the lashes and create a more defined eye shape. This was applied with tiny brushes or even matchsticks, requiring considerable skill to achieve the desired effect without looking obviously painted. Lip colour was perhaps the most controversial aspect of Victorian cosmetics. Bright red lips were associated with actresses, prostitutes, and other women of questionable morality. Respectable ladies aimed for a more natural lip colour, which they achieved by biting their lips or applying subtle tints made from beeswax mixed with various plant dyes. The application of cosmetics was a complex and time-consuming process that often required assistance. Wealthy women had ladies' maids who specialised in cosmetic application, while middle-class women either did their own makeup or relied on family members for help. The goal was to look naturally beautiful, while using enough artificial enhancement to achieve the desired ethereal effect. Removing cosmetics was almost as dangerous as applying them. The lead and mercury-based products were difficult to remove completely, and the cleaning methods often involved harsh soaps or chemical solvents that damaged the skin. Many women developed skin problems from both the cosmetics themselves and the removal process. The cosmetics industry was largely unregulated, which meant that products often contained whatever ingredients were cheap and effective, regardless of safety. Manufacturers made wild claims about the benefits of their products, and consumers had little way of knowing what they were actually applying to their skin. Social attitudes toward cosmetics were complex and contradictory. While everyone could see that certain women were wearing makeup, it was considered vulgar to be obviously painted. The ideal was to look naturally beautiful while using artificial enhancement to achieve that natural look. This required considerable skill and high-quality products that weren't always available. The medical establishment was divided on the issue of cosmetics. Some doctors warned about the dangers of lead and mercury-based products, while others recommended them for various skin conditions. Very few understood the long-term health consequences of regular cosmetic use, and the immediate aesthetic benefits often outweighed concerns about future problems. Class distinctions were important in cosmetic use. The wealthy could afford higher quality, less toxic products, while the poor often used homemade preparations that might be even more dangerous than commercial alternatives. The ability to look fashionably pale and ethereal without obvious artificial enhancement became a mark of social status and sophistication. The Victorian approach to cosmetics represents a fascinating intersection of beauty, technology, and social convention. The desire to conform to specific beauty standards led to the widespread use of dangerous products, while the social requirement to look naturally beautiful created a complex set of rules about appropriate cosmetic use. In many ways, Victorian cosmetics were a perfect metaphor for the era itself. Beautiful on the surface, complex in application, and often dangerous in ways that weren't fully understood at the time. They represented the tension between appearance and reality, between social expectations and personal safety, between the desire for beauty and the limitations of available technology. The legacy of Victorian cosmetics can still be seen today in our ongoing struggles with beauty standards, product safety, and the social pressure to look naturally beautiful while using artificial enhancement to achieve that natural look. The tools have changed, but the fundamental tensions remain remarkably similar. Now that we've covered the daily struggle of Victorian hygiene, let's examine what happened when someone actually got sick. Victorian medicine's approach to illness was like their approach to everything else: elaborate, confident, and frequently more dangerous than the original problem. The Victorian understanding of disease was in transition during this period. The traditional belief in miasma, the idea that disease was caused by bad air or noxious vapours, was gradually giving way to germ theory, though the changeover was slow and often contradictory. This meant that medical treatments often addressed the wrong causes and sometimes made patients sicker rather than better. When a Victorian fell ill, the first line of treatment was usually bed rest, which was actually one of the more sensible approaches. Patients were kept warm, given light foods, and encouraged to rest while their bodies fought off the illness. This worked reasonably well for minor ailments and was probably more effective than many of the more elaborate treatments that followed. For more serious illnesses, Victorian medicine turned to a combination of traditional remedies and newer, scientific approaches. Bloodletting remained popular throughout much of the era, based on the ancient belief that illness was caused by an imbalance of bodily humours. Patients might have significant amounts of blood removed using leeches or by cutting veins, which often weakened them further and made recovery more difficult. Purging was another common treatment, involving the use of powerful laxatives to cleanse the system of whatever was causing the illness. These preparations were often made from dangerous substances like mercury or antimony, which could cause additional health problems while providing little actual benefit. The theory was that illness could be expelled from the body through vigorous purging, but the practice often left patients dehydrated and weakened. Patent medicines were enormously popular and widely available without prescription. These commercial preparations claimed to cure everything from headaches to consumption, and they often contained impressive amounts of alcohol, opium, or other drugs. Many people became accidentally addicted to these medicines while trying to treat minor ailments, and the lack of regulation meant that the contents were often unknown and potentially dangerous. Laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol, was prescribed for almost everything and was available over the counter. It was effective for pain relief and helped patients sleep, but it was also highly addictive and could be fatal in large doses. Many Victorian women became dependent on laudanum while treating various ailments, and overdoses were common. For respiratory illnesses, Victorian medicine relied heavily on steam treatments and inhalation therapies. Patients might be required to breathe steam infused with various herbs or chemicals, or to inhale smoke from burning substances believed to have medicinal properties. Some of these treatments were actually helpful, while others introduced additional toxins into already compromised respiratory systems. Poultices and external applications were used for everything from wounds to internal illnesses. These might contain herbs, animal products, or chemical substances applied directly to the skin. Some poultices were soothing and helped with minor injuries, while others contained irritating or toxic substances that could cause additional problems. The wealthy had access to trained physicians, but medical training was inconsistent and often based on outdated theories. Many doctors still relied on methods that had been used for centuries, while others embraced new techniques that weren't always improvements. The result was that expensive medical care wasn't necessarily better care, and sometimes the poor who relied on folk remedies were actually better off. Surgery was available, but extremely dangerous due to the lack of anaesthesia and antiseptic techniques for much of the Victorian era. Even minor procedures carried significant risk of infection and death, so surgery was usually reserved for life-threatening conditions where the risk of doing nothing outweighed the risk of the procedure itself. Hospitals were generally places of last resort, associated more with charity care for the poor than with healing. Conditions were often unsanitary, overcrowded, and staffed by untrained attendants. Many people preferred to die at home rather than enter a hospital, and this preference was often medically sound given the state of hospital care. Mental illness was particularly poorly understood and treated. Patients might be subjected to various treatments, including cold water baths, mechanical restraints, or isolation. The belief that mental illness was caused by moral weakness or spiritual failings led to treatments that were often more punitive than therapeutic. Women's health issues were often attributed to hysteria or other gender-specific ailments that were thought to be caused by everything from excessive education to insufficient domestic activity. Treatments might include bed rest, travel, or various mechanical devices designed to address supposed physical problems with female anatomy. Prevention was limited by the incomplete understanding of disease transmission. People might take various tonics or follow specific dietary regimens believed to prevent illness, but these were often based on traditional beliefs rather than scientific evidence. The wealthy could afford better nutrition and living conditions, which did provide some protection against disease, even if the mechanisms weren't understood. Home nursing was usually provided by the female family members who learned through experience rather than formal training. These women often developed considerable skill in managing illness and comfort care, and their practical knowledge was sometimes more valuable than formal medical intervention. The pharmaceutical industry was largely unregulated, which meant that medicines often contained unknown or dangerous ingredients. Patients had little way of knowing what they were taking or what effects it might have, and drug interactions were poorly understood. Many people suffered from the side effects of their medications as much as from their original illnesses. Despite these limitations, some Victorian medical practices were actually effective. The emphasis on rest, good nutrition, and comfort care helped many patients recover from illnesses that might have been made worse by more aggressive interventions. The gradual acceptance of germ theory led to improvements in sanitation and hygiene that did reduce disease transmission. The Victorian experience with illness and medical treatment reflects the broader themes of the era: the tension between tradition and innovation, the confidence in scientific progress despite limited understanding, and the significant differences in experience based on social class and economic resources. It was an era of both remarkable medical advances and persistent reliance on dangerous or useless treatments, showing how slowly medical knowledge and practice actually change, even in periods of rapid social transformation. As we reach the end of our journey through the aromatic landscape of Victorian hygiene, it's worth asking, did any of this actually work? Or were the Victorians simply stumbling through life in a fog of coal smoke, body odour, and toxic cosmetics, hoping for the best while slowly poisoning themselves with their own beauty routines? The answer, like most things Victorian, is complicated. In some ways, Victorian hygiene practices were remarkably advanced for their time. The emphasis on clean linen, for example, was actually quite hygienic, even if it wasn't understood in bacterial terms. Regular changes of absorbent undergarments did help control body odour and reduce skin problems, even if the Victorians thought they were simply maintaining social respectability rather than promoting health. The Victorian focus on cleanliness as a moral virtue also had practical benefits. While their methods were often misguided, the social pressure to appear clean and respectable did encourage people to make efforts toward personal hygiene that might otherwise have been neglected. The elaborate social rules around cleanliness created a framework for hygiene practices that, while imperfect, were better than nothing. However, many Victorian hygiene practices were actively harmful. the widespread use of toxic cosmetics probably caused more health problems than they solved. The fear of bathing likely contributed to the spread of diseases that could have been prevented with better washing practices. The reliance on patent medicines and dangerous medical treatments often made illnesses worse rather than better. The class divisions in Victorian hygiene also created significant disparities in health outcomes. The wealthy, with access to better nutrition, cleaner living conditions, and higher quality hygiene products, generally lived longer and healthier lives than the poor. But even the wealthy weren't immune to the dangers of toxic cosmetics and misguided medical treatments. Perhaps most importantly, Victorian hygiene practices show us how slowly and unevenly scientific knowledge translates into practical improvements in daily life. Even as germ theory was being developed and accepted by the medical establishment, most people continued to follow hygiene practices based on social convention, traditional beliefs, and incomplete understanding of health and disease. The Victorian era was a time of transition between traditional and modern approaches to hygiene, between superstition and science, between individual responsibility and public health measures. Many of the hygiene challenges that Victorians faced, urban pollution, industrial chemicals, social pressure to conform to beauty standards, remain relevant today, even if our specific solutions have evolved. What the Victorians got right was recognising that personal hygiene was important for both health and social acceptance. What they got wrong was almost everything about how to achieve it safely and effectively. But their efforts, misguided as they often were, laid the groundwork for the development of modern hygiene practices and public health measures. The Victorian approach to hygiene was ultimately a product of its time, shaped by available technology, prevailing social attitudes, and incomplete scientific knowledge. It was neither the primitive barbarism that we sometimes imagine, nor the sophisticated system that Victorians themselves believed it to be. It was a complex, contradictory, and often dangerous set of practices that reflected the broader tensions and contradictions of Victorian society itself. In the end, the story of Victorian hygiene is really a story about human adaptability and the slow, imperfect progress of civilization. Faced with unprecedented urban growth, industrial pollution, and social change, the Victorians developed elaborate systems for managing the challenges of personal cleanliness and social respectability. These systems were often flawed and sometimes dangerous, but they represented genuine attempts to solve real problems with the tools and knowledge available at the time. The legacy of Victorian hygiene can still be seen in our modern attitudes toward cleanliness, beauty, and health. We still struggle with many of the same tensions between individual choice and social pressure, between natural and artificial approaches to beauty, between innovation and tradition in health practices. The specific details have changed, but the fundamental challenges of maintaining personal hygiene in a complex modern society remain remarkably similar. Perhaps the most important lesson from Victorian hygiene is that progress in human health and well-being is neither linear nor inevitable. It requires not just scientific advancement, but also social change, technological development, and the gradual evolution of cultural attitudes and practices. The Victorians did the best they could with what they had, and in many ways, so do we. The difference is that we have the benefit of their mistakes to learn from, even as we make our own new ones. So the next time you turn on a hot shower, apply modern deodorant, or brush your teeth with fluoride toothpaste, spare a thought for the Victorians who struggled with these same basic human needs, using arsenic-based cosmetics, toxic patent medicines, and the occasional weekly bath. They may not have gotten it right, but their efforts paved the way for the safer, more effective hygiene practices we take for granted today. And now, as we conclude this aromatic journey through the past, you can rest easy, knowing that your own hygiene challenges are relatively simple compared to those faced by our Victorian ancestors. Sweet dreams, and may your sleep be free from the ghostly scratching of historical lice and the lingering scent of coal smoke and regret.